called Undisputed. He told me that the host was talking some crazy stuff and that I needed to check it out just for a laugh. So I turned it on and watched the segment he wanted me to watch, and dang it, I was hooked. I didn't want to be, but there was something about the show that I found entertaining, and I realized quite quickly that this show was very pro-Cowboys, mostly because Skip Bayless was a longtime Cowboy fan and a former beat writer for the team. In short, the show had a clear bias, but I still watched certain segments, mostly kept it on in the background. Unfortunately, that did lead me to search up clips of the show from YouTube, which of course altered my algorithm, which led me to start getting recommendations for other FS1 shows like Speak. And of course, first things first. Speak, for the most part, was relatively unbiased, with a slight lean toward the Eagles and Packers stories, given that 3 of the hosts were former players that played for those teams. But it was first things first that really captured my attention. The 3 hosts had insane chemistry. But, as all shows do, I realized that the show had a bias toward the Kansas City Chiefs, and I would also discover that it was more about hot takes than anything else. It really left me wanting for more content based on the team that I liked. And so, in order to do that, I decided to search up some content on YouTube that was more focused on the 49ers, which led me to discover content creators like Larry Krueger, Damon Bruce, Brad Graham, and of course, the person that Niner fans love to hate, Grant Cohn. And while the content was good, it was actually Grant that I gravitated toward because he would give what I thought at the time was the most honest take. That's when Brock Purdy's injury happened. Man, you want to talk about a 180. A few short weeks before the injury, when the Niners played Seattle, everyone was praising him as the next big quarterback.
Brock Purdy is the 49ers franchise quarterback. It's over. It's his job. Forget about it. You're not taking it from him.
Some were even daring enough to call him the modern-day Joe Montana that could do the impossible and become the first rookie quarterback to not only start a Super Bowl, but win it. That's how good he was playing. After the Eagles game, though, suddenly he was nothing more than the last pick in the draft that got carried to the playoffs by the best roster in the NFL. He truly was Mr. Irrelevant.
Yeah. So what's it going to be like
to me,
we don't know.
He is a backup quarterback, a high-level backup. A high-level backup.
And that's when I realized that I had fallen into the trap that I had told myself long ago to watch out for, because I began to think to myself, maybe that's really all he is. And then I started watching more segments from the shows I mentioned earlier, and they were all saying the same thing. Well, of course the Niners couldn't beat the Eagles. They didn't have a superstar quarterback. Or can we finally put the Brock Purdy story to rest? Or Brock Purdy is nothing more than an average quarterback who got carried to the playoffs by the same team and coach that made Jimmy Garoppolo look good. It felt a little disrespectful, if I'm being completely honest. Little did I know, though, that was just the beginning. With Purdy's injury being as severe as it was and requiring surgery, suddenly the narrative switched from Brock Purdy looks like the future of the franchise to Brock Purdy simply isn't that guy. And it was made worse during the offseason because instead of doing what normal quarterbacks do, building chemistry with his receivers, getting more reps to improve his mechanics, etc., he had to spend his entire offseason rehabbing his elbow. It's interesting when you think about it. During his first training camp, he was a third-string rookie that got no reps with the starters, and during his first full offseason after he became the starting quarterback, he couldn't get reps with the starters because he was rehabbing. So when you hear the media start talking about how Brock Purdy hadn't yet had to face adversity, you kind of had to sit back and laugh, because not being able to practice your craft with your teammates really does seem like adversity to me. Never mind the fact that you were already facing scrutiny for being the last pick in the draft. But I digress. As far as they were concerned, Brock Purdy was a flash in the pan, and while it was a good story, he simply wasn't good enough. Some of the more common themes I heard when people were discussing Purdy were, he's too small. Brock Purdy is listed as 6'1", and yet somehow that makes him tiny. But if you were to ask these same people about Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Tua Tagovailoa, or Caleb Williams, suddenly their height is just fine and doesn't hinder them. Brock Purdy is also listed at 220 pounds, and he's called too light. But if you were to ask these same people about, again, Jalen Hurts or Trevor Lawrence or Matthew Stafford or Baker Mayfield, suddenly their weight doesn't make a difference. And I think my personal favorite is that Brock Purdy has tiny hands. They're only 9¼ inches. But I wonder if anyone has ever told Patrick Mahomes that he has tiny hands. It doesn't really seem to matter when it comes to him. Now, before anyone accuses me of directly comparing these quarterbacks to each other, I'm not. I'm simply pointing out that there is a direct double standard when it comes to describing the attributes of Brock Purdy as being a hindrance to his performance versus those same attributes shared by other quarterbacks that are seen as better than Purdy. And the same goes for other arguments against him that the media loves to bring up. He's not the fastest. He has a weak arm. He needs everything around him to be perfect in order for him to succeed. It gets to the point where as you listen to members of the media keep rehashing the same arguments over and over and over again, that it begins to sound very familiar. If we're really being honest though, there's one major difference between those other quarterbacks that I mentioned and Purdy. It's that those quarterbacks were drafted much higher than he was. What's funny is that there are some people in the media that will actually tell the truth and tell you straight up that people look down on him because of his draft status, which, if I'm being honest, makes me respect them just a bit more. Do I wish they could actually get past his draft status and look at what he's done in his first season instead? Sure, but most people simply can't get past their own bias, which brings us back to the offseason. Everyone was waiting to see what was going to happen with the starting quarterback position. Purdy was rehabbing his elbow, Trey Lance was finally healed and ready to play, and Kyle Shanahan brought in a third quarterback as a possible starter/backup, one Sam Darnold. The media had a field day with this because many fans were hoping that the Niners were finally going to have an offseason where there would be no quarterback controversy, and it got so much worse when before the regular season even started, it was announced that Trey Lance would be traded to the Dallas Cowboys for a 4th-round pick, and that Brock Purdy, after recovering from major elbow surgery, would be the official starting quarterback. Let's break that down for a moment. The quarterback that the team spent 3 first-round picks and an additional 3rd-round pick was being traded for a 4th-round pick to a rival team, and it was decided that the quarterback that was drafted dead last was a better choice. And that's why I mentioned in a previous episode that I believe it was this decision that turned media members off of Brock Purdy. He was essentially paying for the sins of the team that drafted him. Now, perhaps that sounds too dramatic, but it's really how I feel. Fans of Trey Lance, especially in the media, just couldn't get over the fact that he was never given a real chance to prove himself and instead lost a starting job to a player they deemed inferior. And that's totally fair. The only problem with that was that we were about to start game 1 of the 2023 season, and the media was ready to pounce. And it certainly didn't help that the first team that Purdy and the Niners were going to face were the Pittsburgh Steelers, who just happened to have a quarterback drafted in the same year as Purdy. In fact, it just so happened to be the first quarterback that was drafted that year. Perception versus reality. It's an old adage that has since become a meme, but I feel like it's also perfect to describe the journey of our underdogs so far. And that was on full display when it came to the first game the Niners would play to start their 2023 season. In the first season of this series, I took you through the journey of Brock Purdy's first NFL season through the eyes of someone who was becoming a football fan for the first time. Me. I wasn't tainted by what the media wanted me to see or what they wanted me to think. I simply saw a player who was finally given a chance to show what he could do after being picked last in the draft. Coming into his first complete season though, this time I was following along with him and what everyone else was saying about him. And so I thought, that's how I'm going to present season 2. We're going to be taking a look at what Purdy was doing on the field versus what the media and other people were saying about him and see what did match up and what was questionable. And I think it's fitting that we begin with this game because, as I mentioned last episode, the Niners were facing the Steelers. And in the 2022 draft, the same draft that Purdy was taken in, the Steelers were in need of a quarterback. And so with their first pick, they took a quarterback by the name of Kenny Pickett. And here's where we have our first instance of a first-round quarterback versus the last pick in the draft, and the perception of both of them. So let's start with this one. Obviously, Kenny Pickett is better than Brock Purdy. I mean, he was the last pick for a reason, right? But if you were to compare Pickett's first NFL season with Purdy's, you would see that despite playing in 7 more games than Purdy did, Purdy came out looking a lot different than Pickett. Let's start with touchdowns and interceptions. In 13 games, Pickett had 7 passing touchdowns to 9 interceptions, while Purdy, who only played in 7 games, and yes, I'm going to count that KC game because he did throw the ball at least 4 times, had 13 passing touchdowns to only 4 interceptions. And if you want to throw in rushing touchdowns, then we can bump Pickett up to 10 and Purdy up to 14. Now, I know exactly what you're going to say. Pickett wasn't drafted into the best situation like Purdy was. Except one thing I don't hear people mention really ever when talking about Purdy's situation is this. Purdy wasn't a starting quarterback when he was drafted. Not only was he not allowed to have reps with the starters, he barely got reps with the backups. I mean, he did get reps, but with the scout team, the practice squad. He literally had to take what he himself called mental reps because of the amount of practice time he got. Now, that was eased a bit when he became the backup, but that still didn't afford him enough time with the starters to make any meaningful impact. And yet, when he took over as a starter, the team didn't skip a beat. And I know what you're going to say to that. The Niners had the best skill position roster in the NFL. Except, no, they really didn't. If you were to look at the receiving stats for 2022, do you know what number you would see next to the first receiver for the 49ers based solely on yards? 22. Brandon Ayuk only had 1,015 yards. Number 1 had 1,809. Fine. What about the next 49er? 20 spots later, you'd have George Kittle at 42. See, George Kittle only had 765 yards, followed by McCaffrey at 45 with 741. This was followed by Deebo Samuel at number 58 with 632, and just to round out the list, Juwan Jennings came in at 111 with 416. So let's put that into perspective. Combined, Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel had 1,647 yards. That's good for two. Meanwhile, as I mentioned before, number 1 had 1,809 and number 2 had 1,710. So Justin Jefferson and Tyreek Hill proved that they were the best receivers in the league. And before you tell me that George Kittle made up the difference, there were 4 tight ends that had better receiving yards than he did. But of course, that's just receiving because I know the next argument, and it can really be summed up in only 3 letters. CMC. And you know what? Yeah, he was phenomenal. He was the best running back in the... Now, according to this, his numbers would indicate that he was only the 8th best running back in the league. Surely that must be wrong because the media was telling me the entire time that he was the best. So this one actually might be a little tongue-in-cheek because Christian McCaffrey wasn't only a running threat, and if you actually take his combined stats into account, he actually might have been the best running back after his trade to San Francisco. But that really doesn't help my argument, so we're just going to move on from that. I don't want to sit here and rattle off stats though, because that would be boring. Because I actually do understand what the media was trying to say. Individually, the players weren't lighting the world on fire, except for maybe Kittle and Christian McCaffrey. But together, yeah, they were probably the best roster in the NFL. But that really had to do with one major factor. Say what you want about him now, but in all honesty, Kyle Shanahan knows how to design a play to get his players open. All he needed was the right quarterback. Also, I know it may be an archaic stat, but passer rating is still used today to determine a good passing quarterback. And in all of 2022, Kenny Pickett's best passer rating was 90.9, while Purdy's worst passer rating was only 87.4, which happened in the playoffs against Dallas. Why do I bring this all up? Well, if you remember, in the intro, I mentioned that one of the quarterbacks playing had a perfect offseason, while the other one was Brock Purdy. Even though Kenny Pickett had only played 5 drives during the entire preseason, the team scored touchdowns on all 5 of them. With all of his stats from all of the preseason games combined, he achieved a passer rating of 158.3. In other words, he was perfect. And that gave Steelers fans hope for the game against San Francisco, especially given the fact that the other quarterback had a much different preseason experience. Many people weren't even sure if Purdy was even going to be ready for the preseason, and when he did play, his stats were less than spectacular. He was only ever able to achieve a passer rating of 69, and the media wasn't giving him a chance at all. And then the game happened. Let's start off with a player by the name of Patrick Peterson. Now, from what I've heard, he's most likely going to be going into the Hall of Fame, but that didn't stop him from predicting at least 1 interception on Purdy because of tells that he had observed in his film study.
So no question that we're we're hugged up on our coverage and make sure that we have sound communication at all times, because there is some tell signs out there that tells us what plays we're going to get when those guys in certain situations.
So wait a minute. So you got a little insight on just from your film study, telling signs on when they're gonna do certain things already?
Come on, Mac. You
got your cheat code ready?
Come on, Mac. You watched film before.
I'm not gonna ask you to tell me what have you picked out of, okay? We don't know who's watching or who's listening, so we're gonna let that be.
Before, Mac. Yeah. When I get my pick Sunday, we'll talk about it.
That's what I like to hear.
What do you see in Brock's Brock Purdy's game?
Say, what do I see?
Yeah.
It's a very friendly quarterback system. I believe they do a great job of getting the football in their playmakers' hands in short grass, and those guys just do the rest after that. Not saying that he can't throw the ball down the field or make those big throws. It's just something we just haven't seen on tape. So it just looked like he's comfortable with what Kyle calls. And it's been a lot of screens, a lot of mixed direction plays, a lot of drag and over routes. And the receivers, the pass catchers, once they get the ball in their hands, those are the guys who's making the hay after.
And when the game happened, both of Purdy's 2 touchdown passes were on Patrick Peterson.
I believe they do a great job of getting the football in their playmakers' hands in short grass, and those guys just do the rest after that. Not saying that he can't throw the ball down the field or make those big throws. It's just something we just haven't seen on tape.
You mentioned during the week that you thought that there were some tells in their offense. Did they ditch those? Or?
It was there. I had an opportunity to get 2 bigs. I just didn't grab it in. But credit to those guys. Those guys did a great job of sticking to their game plan and really get into their identity, which is run the football, mix directions, hit those bang aids, hit those deep stops. That's just what he do. He just wasn't in good enough position to make those plays.
And after the game, he tried to play dumb, but we all know that he knew exactly what he was doing.
So. Were you aware at that moment that it was Patrick Peterson who was in coverage on the touchdown?
Honestly, at first, no. I wasn't thinking about any of that. BA was open. He did a great job on the route and got him the ball, scored a touchdown. And then the second touchdown on the right side, the deep ball. Was that on Patrick Peterson? Yeah, and that one, I was like, all right, that felt good. But it was good, man. He's a competitor. I have nothing but respect for Patrick Peterson and everything that he does. So.
After all was said and done, Purdy finished with a respectable stat line, but that really wasn't what was important about this game. And it's the reason why I'm coming into the season differently, because it was the media response to this game that I found fascinating.
I would have thought when Jimmy G went down and we got the final pick of the draft to step in, that everyone would agree, oh, this is like, it's amazing that we're actually getting this in real life, not just in a thought exercise, but a real life test, an experiment of with Christian McCaffrey, with Deebo Samuel, with Brandon Ayuk, with George Kittle, with all pros everywhere, with Trent Williams. Can you drop anybody in and that offense work? And when Mr. Irrelevant comes in and goes undefeated, they'd be like, well, God dog it. I guess you can. Instead, everyone is like, you know what? This kid's amazing. I don't believe it.
And we have now. I know Nick crouched it with George Kittle, with Deebo.
Yes, with
so
all
I
these
couldn't
all-pros.
bring up, or he thought I couldn't bring up.
I don't want you to
Nick
bring up
Mullins,
stuff from 7 years ago.
Beckford.
Yes, I'm talking about
the
these
guys
players.
that had them 1 and 10 before
players,
Jimmy G
we're not
got
talking
there.
about that. We're talking about this team with these players.
The bottom line, Nick, is he did beat out Trey Lance.
Okay, that's fine.
He did beat out, Sam Darnold.
Okay, so did Baker.
So what I'm saying is Brock Purdy is legit.
Okay.
For him to get those, we've only seen him for what?
That's my
10
point.
games?
Right. So no,
we know
he
he's
has not
good.
silenced me.
We'll
I don't
see
know
if
that
he's.
yet.
Oh, we know he's good.
I don't know that yet.
So
What
Dak
we don't know
Prescott
is
can
if
lead
he's
the
great.
league in interceptions.
Dak
Do you
Prescott's
believe
been in
him?
the league for 7 years. He has a 49-yard
hasn't been as
season.
far as this
a
kid.
37. Okay.
Seriously.
Yes.
He's
you're
gotten
right.
a team to.
It's a
Dak.
team.
It's not like Dak's been playing with scrubs.
Okay, that's fine. It's fine. It's just Jimmy G 2.0.
Has he
It's
been
the
playing with
Niners
scrubs?
with Shanahan and these weapons do great. We all see the quarterbacks limited, and then we're like, they win. It's the quarterback.
Which brings me to the next change that I plan on making this season. While this series mainly follows Brock Purdy and his journey through the NFL, one of the media's main narratives has to do with the team around him. And while Deebo, Ayuk, Kittle, and Juszczyk are important to Purdy's story, there was another name that was starting to emerge as the 49ers' true star. And isn't it interesting that the man that Purdy helped when he was first traded to the team would also be the man the media used to discredit him the most? Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and Joe Burrow. These 4 men are widely considered the 4 best quarterbacks in the league, and for good reason. Patrick Mahomes is a 3-time Super Bowl champion. Joe Burrow is one of the few quarterbacks to have ever beaten the Kansas City Chiefs in a playoff game, and in doing so, made it to the Super Bowl. Lamar Jackson is a 2-time MVP. And Josh Allen is simply one of the most naturally gifted quarterbacks in the league, though now he can also add an MVP to his resume. What about Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Stephon Diggs, and Jamar Chase? These 4 men are considered, or have been considered, 4 of the best players at their respective positions. What do all of these men have to do with one another? Well, these 4 men play with, or have played with these 4 men, and have been considered weapons for each of them. But interestingly enough, when we talk about these 4 men, they're never penalized for having these 4 men around them. I wonder why that is. Actually, I have a theory, and to illustrate that theory, I'm going to list those names again, only in a different order. Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews, Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs, Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. And now I'm going to list some more names to compare them to. Brock Purdy and George Kittle, Brock Purdy and Deebo Samuel, Brock Purdy and Brandon Ayuk, and finally Brock Purdy and Christian McCaffrey. Now in the first example, each quarterback has, or had, one main target to throw to, one weapon at their disposal. That's not to say that they didn't all have secondary targets, and in some cases even more than 2, but generally speaking, each one of them had a main target. Purdy, on the other hand, at any given time, at least in his first 9 games, if you really want to count the NFC Championship, didn't have just one main target. He had, if you count Kyle Juszczyk and Juwan Jennings, 6 different players he could throw to at any time, as long as it wasn't a run play. Well, why is that? But simply, that's what the offensive system was designed to do. Only, that's not exactly how it used to look. Full disclaimer, I wasn't necessarily a fan during the Jimmy Garoppolo years. Heck, I really wasn't even a football fan during that time. But from what I've seen and read from other 49er fans, Jimmy's first read was usually the person who got the ball, while the other players played decoy to clear out the other defensive players so they couldn't interfere with the main target. But people quickly realized that's not how the new offense was being run. But don't take my word for it. In an interview with, at the time, teammate Eric Armstead, Brandon Ayuk described what it was like playing in this new offense with a quarterback who wasn't afraid to spread the ball around.
Because even like there'll be plays out there where it's like, in the past, like we might call this play and you have no chance of getting the football. But when you're playing with a guy like Purdy, like you have an opportunity to get the ball on any given play. Like even when you run down the field, and for the past 3 years, this is a clear out, just clear out the defense, and somebody else is getting the ball, and you look up, the ball's literally in the air, right there. So, yeah, playing with him, it's just really just preparing myself. Get ready each and every week to be my best self on Sunday, because I know he's going to give me the opportunity.
And I think more than anything, that's what set this offense apart from some others, and why I think they were considered the best roster in the league. It was a team that executed one of the most complex systems and made it seem like any quarterback could succeed in it, because they didn't really have to do a lot. They just needed to play within it and not make mistakes. And so we've come to it, the dreaded system quarterback narrative. You see, Kyle Shanahan had developed a perfect system for any quarterback to step into because the team around him did all of the work, and a quarterback just needed to throw the ball on time and to the right target. So I have a genuine question that if you're watching this and would like to answer in the comments, I would love to see. What exactly is the true job of a quarterback? Is it to get the ball out as quickly as possible to one of the skill position players so that they can execute the play as designed? Or is it to make every single play by themselves? I'm genuinely curious about this. Now that may sound like a sarcastic question, but it really isn't. The reason I ask this is because a lot of the media likes to point out that Brock Purdy is simply a guy that gets the ball into his playmakers' hands and then they do the rest of the work. But I genuinely thought that's what a quarterback's job was. Or, before I get pushback, when a play breaks down or no one is able to get open, Then, and only then, should a quarterback either throw the ball away to avoid a sack, or in other cases, keep the ball themselves and attempt to make a play off schedule. And by the way, I'm not including design quarterback runs in this only because at the time, while Purdy was able to show that he could scramble when needed, he was never going to be confused with Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen or even Jalen Hurts. So what does any of what I just said actually have to do with the main theme of this episode? Put simply, the team was being used as a way to explain away Purdy's success, and one team member in particular was being mentioned the most. That, of course, was Christian McCaffrey. It's no secret that once the 49ers acquired him, the offense got better. To say otherwise would be lying, and it would be a little disingenuous. But do you know what also would be a lie and a little disingenuous? To say that Brock Purdy also didn't have an impact after he took over as a starter. Now, let's be clear. CMC is one of the best running backs in the league, and he'd been a powerhouse ever since he was drafted into it. But one of the questions that no one in the media seemed to be asking every time he was brought up to discredit Purdy was this: if CMC was as good as people said, why weren't the Panthers playoff contenders every year he was with the team? And before you respond, I understand that at points during each of the seasons he played for the team, he was injured. Trust me, I found that out the first year I was able to draft him in fantasy. He was on injured reserve for like half the season. But the actual answer is both simple and a little complex at the same time. The simple answer is that the Carolina Panthers didn't have the same kind of offensive scheme, head coach, general manager, or really anything close to what the Niners had. But the slightly more complex answer, and kind of the elephant in the room that no one likes to bring up, is that on the Panthers, McCaffrey didn't have the right team members around him. Let me explain. I mentioned that Purdy truly does have multiple targets that he can throw to at any time, and there's a reason for that. It's because the opposing defense has to account for every single skill position player on the team. If they try and stop one specific player, Debo for example, Purdy can usually find another and throw to him, whether that be Kittle, Ayuk, or McCaffrey. And if he really needs to, he can even throw to the fullback. So what does this have to do with CMC? Well, on the Panthers, he was seen as the cornerstone of the offense. The defense knew that if he was on the field, they would have to do whatever it took to stop him. On the 49ers, however, he was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. You could try to stop him from running, but the chances of him having a blocker, whether that be Kyle Juszczyk, George Kittle, or one of his favorite blockers, Brandon Ayuk, were very good. But as I said in the last episode, McCaffrey was one of the league's best receiving backs, and that made things even worse for opposing defenses. If they tried to double cover McCaffrey, they were leaving Ayuk, Debo, and Kittle open to make plays, and because Purdy wasn't afraid to throw to them, double covering McCaffrey wouldn't work. But on the other side, because of all those other players, if they decided to cover them, they risked leaving McCaffrey open to take the check down. And this is why it didn't make sense that Purdy was being penalized for being on the Niners. The team did elevate Purdy, that was abundantly clear, but he elevated them just as much. They were playing like a complete offense, one that was very tough to stop. But it was McCaffrey that was getting a lot of the credit because he did bring an extra explosiveness to the team that seemed to be missing. And that became even more apparent in week 4 against the Cardinals. Now, as I've been talking, I've been showing highlights of the games from weeks 2 and 3. One of the things you may not know about those games is that in week 2 against the Rams, Brandon Ayuk suffered a minor injury to a shoulder that would keep him out of the game in week 3 against the Giants. And so it was this game that we saw him without one of his main deep threats. Now, many people will say that the Rams game wasn't one of his best, but the Niners were still able to put up 30 points, including a game-tying drive before the end of the first half. Purdy would drive the team down the field with 2 minutes left and tie the game with a quarterback sneak. Not for nothing, even the commentators mentioned that Purdy didn't need any extra assistance to get the ball into the end zone. Take that for how you will. Going into week 3, the Niners would be without Ayuk, and they would be going against a team that liked to blitz. In fact, according to Next Gen Stats, of the 39 dropbacks that Purdy took, the Giants blitzed him on 33 of them. And yeah, in the first half, that did indeed throw him off a little bit, but he settled down in the second half and made the Giants pay for blitzing him so much with shots to both Kittle and Debo, including that beautiful touchdown pass to put the game away. But it was in week 4 that the offense really looked dominant from start to finish. For his part, Purdy did extremely well. He completed 20 of 21 passes, giving him, at the time, the 4th highest single game completion percentage of all time with 95.2%. Averaged 13.5 yards per attempt and threw for 1 touchdown, and added another rushing touchdown to his resume with another quarterback sneak after a long drive. But all of that really wasn't talked about because the true star of that game, rightfully so, was CMC. He rushed for 106 yards, he rushed for 3 touchdowns, and he caught Purdy's only passing touchdown. He took over that game and made everyone forget about the rest of the team, and it was very impressive. But it was also giving the media the fuel it needed as they continued to discount what Purdy was bringing to the table. Luckily, Week 5 was approaching, and that meant that an old rival was coming to town to avenge what happened to them in the playoffs of the previous season. But that's not all it meant. It also meant that everyone's favorite media personality was going to be in rare form. It's a rivalry that spans generations. If you were to ask any football fan to name one of the NFL's greatest rivalries, the chances of them naming the Niners versus the Cowboys as one of them would be great. Growing up, even though I didn't like football, my dad did. And as a lifelong Niners fan, he would remind me from time to time that we don't like Dallas in this household. Now, as I've mentioned before, I really became a football fan in 2022. But if I'm being honest, I attached myself more to a single player than I did any team. But that all changed when I followed in my dad's footsteps and became a Niner fan myself. Now, of course, that was because of a certain underdog quarterback, but it didn't really matter to him when I told him. Although, I did have a laugh when I told him I had picked a team, and his immediate response was, "Please don't tell me it's Dallas. I may not make it through that." He laughed, but there was a tiny part of me that wondered. So when the two teams faced each other in the 2022 divisional round, I got to see what the modern day rivalry was like, and that game wasn't really great. The Dallas defense did a great job of keeping pretty contained, and like I mentioned in a previous episode, the Cowboys could have easily won that game. But Purdy did a much better job of keeping the ball safe, while Dak did not. And we really don't need to talk about that last play that Dallas tried to pull off. I mean, legend says that part of Zeke's soul is still trapped in Levi's after he got flattened. Seriously, what were they thinking? Anyway, I really hadn't gotten into all of the news and other content that was available, except for the 3 shows on FS1. First things first, Speak and Undisputed. Now, I've already mentioned those shows in the first episode of the season, so go and give that a watch if you haven't already. So the first 4 weeks of the season flew by, and I hadn't really been paying attention to the schedule. That was, of course, until a segment aired on Undisputed where they were talking about the Week 5 game. The Cowboys were coming back to Levi's for revenge. I watched segments from each of the 3 shows to see what each of them were saying and trying to get a feel for how the media was treating this game. And at the time, it really did seem like this was going to be one of the biggest games of the season. Not only was the game in the coveted Sunday Night Football slot, but both teams were having, for the most part, a dominating season. However, the Cowboys were coming into the game at 3-1 after a blowout win against the Patriots, while the Niners were coming into the game at 4-0 after a decisive win against the Cardinals. Now, it should be said that the 1 in that 3-1 just so happened to be as a result of a loss against the Cardinals, so instantly many people thought that the Niners had the advantage. However, to the Cowboys' credit, their defense had done the job against Purdy in the offense back in the playoffs, so it was safe to assume that after their blowout wins against the Giants, the Jets, and the Patriots, that they were poised to make a stand against an offense that really did seem unstoppable. Except back in the playoffs, they were facing a rookie that had only had, at the time, 6 games under his belt, leading an offense that he was still getting used to. This time, however, they were facing an offense that was more cohesive, with a quarterback who was getting more and more comfortable running the offense, while also getting more and more comfortable being a starting quarterback and a leader. And for the most part, that really wasn't something I was hearing a lot when it came to what the media was saying. Except, I actually did hear a few things from the media, and one of them was from a very unlikely source. Enter Skip Bayless. Listen, say what you want about him. Goodness knows that when I first turned on Undisputed, it took me a good second to get used to him. But when I really sat back and looked at it from a different perspective, I realized that my annoyance with him was my problem. And when I treated it as entertainment rather than hard-hitting sports analysis, I started to enjoy myself watching it a lot more. It's honestly what helped me get past all of the Cowboy talk. And while the lead up to this game was what I thought it was going to be in terms of all of his Cowboy love, it was his take on Brock Purdy that actually made made me sit back and gain a little bit of respect for him because he did something that not a lot of others in the media, at least on FS1, were doing. He was giving Purdy the credit that he had, in my opinion, rightfully earned.
All right, here's the point. Brock Purdy scares me to death going into Sunday night because the harder I look, the better he looks. The more I want him to mess up, screw up, get exposed, the harder I look for that, the more he does nothing wrong. I'm saying, what does he ever do wrong? You talk about only 5 touchdowns, 0 picks in 4 games. He just does not turn the ball over, and yet he is running away with QBR. He's running away with it. He has surpassed Tua by 6 points. That's a huge gap. He is running away with passer rating. And the key stat that he's running away with exposes all those people who think that he's just a game manager system quarterback, because check this out. On passes thrown over 10 yards this year in the National Football League, he leads the league with 72% completion of 10 or more yards. I'm sorry. Kyle Shanahan keeps trying to tell you, I took the training wheels completely off. We do everything we want to do with this kid because he's shown me again and again, under fire, under pressure, biggest moments, that he will execute whatever play I want to call.
For all of the entertainment that Skip provided leading up to this game, I genuinely believe that this moment was, well, genuine. Now, for all I know, that was just for show. But I choose to believe that he was being genuine in that moment. Now, on the other side of that coin, we have a man by the name of Nick Wright. 49ers fans know exactly who I'm talking about. He is one of the co-hosts of another show on FS1, First Things First. I could probably do an entire episode on Nick Wright, and I don't think that would still be enough. Now, as I acknowledged in the first episode of this season, First Things First was, in my opinion, a hotbed of hot takes, and in all honesty, they mostly came from Nick Wright. But it's weird. Coming from Skip, I've always seen his takes about the Cowboys as entertaining, but when the takes come from Nick Wright, I see nothing but red. Now, in reality, I know that I shouldn't take anything he says seriously, but he has this way of pushing the right buttons. He's like a really good heel in professional wrestling. If you know, you know. And to his credit, he really is good at his job. But to say that he's not a Purdy fan would be a severe understatement. From what I've been able to piece together, his skepticism derives from the fact that he was never a Jimmy G fan.
I know they have the best weapons in the division with respect to Pitts and London down in Atlanta. They have the best weapons in that division. Also, Atlanta's in the NFC South, so it doesn't matter. I was thinking of the NFC as a whole. Right. I think they have the best coach in the division with respect to Sean McVay, because Kyle Shanahan owns Sean McVay and has shown that the NFC Championship game notwithstanding. The only hurdle is the quarterback. And they showed you last night that nights that Jimmy closes his eyes and wishes upon a star and throws a touchdown instead of a pick, they can look dominant. Yeah. They can look utterly and thoroughly dominant.
A lot of nights like that, Nick.
No, there's not. I mean,
a lot of nights like
there's
that.
Not a lot of nights.
No, actually, there's 34. No, 32 and 15 is what their record is with Jimmy G starting. And this coach that you think, and he has owned Sean McVay, I'll give you that. But better, I wouldn't call him better than Sean McVay. And Nick, here's the thing about that quarterback. I would argue, because again, Geno Smith's gonna turn into a pumpkin within the next 2 weeks, that Jimmy G is playing the best at that position in the division.
Drew, hold on. No, we can't. Hold on. No. You jumped in on me. I gotta jump in real quick.
Let me see.
We are 8 days removed from him self-safetying. We can't have that short of a
Steve
memory.
McNair self-safety.
Right,
I mean, really, I'm not going to hold that against him for the rest of it. It's not going to define his career. True. It defined Darren Orlovsky's, because Darren Orlovsky, with all due respect, didn't have much of an NFL career. Sure. Jimmy G's been to a Super Bowl, NFC title game. He's been winning. So that's not going to define.
He was terrible. He was terrible. They scored.
Lamar Jackson, you just blamed their loss on him yesterday.
Yeah, but he was great for 3 straight weeks. You think Jimmy G's played the best of any quarterback in that division?
Without Jimmy G, they get into the Super Bowl.
Well, yeah, either with Brock Purdy or Baker Mayfield. Listen, they have made that offense idiot-proof, as proven by the fact that Brock Purdy came in yesterday. Honest question. If you were watching on a 17-inch, Samsung from back in the day, and you didn't have HD, and you came in midway through the first quarter and you didn't have sound, would you have known that wasn't Jimmy G out there? I wouldn't have. I'd have been like, oh, a little quick slant to an awesome skill position guy who is then making people miss. I'm like, oh, it is plug and
That's
play.
That's an insult to Jimmy G?
No, it is simply saying so I don't know if Brock Purdy is going to be able to be just baseline competent. C.J. Beathard and Nick Mullins and Brian Hoyer obviously were not. But if Purdy could be, or if Baker Mayfield could be, and if Baker can do it anywhere, it would be in that offense, the Niners are a juggernaut. They have the best defense in football. They have the best left tackle in football. They have the best trio of tight end, wide receiver, running back in football. They have all of those things. They just, prior to yesterday, hadn't allowed a point in the second half in a month.
And because he deemed Garoppolo a bad quarterback who looked good under Kyle Shanahan, he immediately fell under the Purdy is only good because of the team around him umbrella. After all, that's what many people were saying about Jimmy G. And while this episode is not really about Nick Wright, trust me, that comes later, I couldn't help but notice the difference in how each show was approaching this game. Skip was being Skip, but I put that down to the fact that he was a biased Cowboys fan, while Nick was coming into this game with a firm belief that Dallas was a much better team with a much better quarterback.
So just get a win and it's an A.
Yeah, I don't think they need an A game because these are two evenly matched teams. The Cowboys don't have to play perfect to beat the Niners unless the Niners play perfect. Now, I do think the Cowboys' defense needs to play damn close to an A game for them to play as well as I think they're going to play. Most notably, going to have to be the first team all season to try to mitigate Christian McCaffrey's impact on the game. But I love the Cowboys in this spot. I love them plus the 3.5. I like them a lot to win outright. I think the Niners are flying a bit too high. I think Dallas matches up really well with them, and I think we are going to see the Niners tested for the first time since those last two playoff games. The Cowboys playoff game was an excellent game. The fact the Cowboys missed an extra point, Dak made a couple critical mistakes that were caught, Purdy made a couple critical mistakes that weren't, and the Niners ended up having control of the game starting in the fourth quarter and rode it to the finish line. I think the Cowboys are primed to put a level of defensive pressure on San Francisco that they have not faced all year long.
The one thing they did have in common, though, was the fact that both of them gave the Niners zero chance of winning this game. And can I just say that watching that game as it was happening was one of the best experiences I've ever had watching a game on TV, because right before everyone's eyes, Brock Purdy was proving everyone who said that he and the Niners were going to lose absolutely wrong. So let's talk about the game. First, I want to touch on something I mentioned in a previous episode that was really on full display in this game. The Niners defense basically locked CeeDee Lamb out of this game. He had 4 catches on 5 targets for a total of 49 yards. He was basically a non-factor in this game, which was concerning for the team because Lamb was the best receiver on it. So with his main weapon all but taken away, Dak was forced to spread the ball around, and while that did lead to a touchdown early in the game, that only resulted in about 161 yards of passing offense. Purdy, though, as mentioned before, was not afraid to spread the ball around, and in this game, he didn't really focus on one main target. Well, I suppose that's not exactly 100% true. Of all the narratives that has surrounded Purdy up until this point, the one that could be easily debunked was this one. Purdy doesn't elevate the team elevates him. And while I completely understand that stats don't tell the whole story, what stats can do is show how something has improved from one point in time to another. And that brings me to George Kittle. See, I believe, after having watched him play and seeing a lot of his highlights, that he will go down as one of the best tight ends of all time. And this really isn't a debate that I want to engage in at this moment, so go ahead and save your comments on that. Having been with the team since 2017, he's had some really, really good seasons and some so-so seasons. But one thing I noticed was that while his production has always been good to great, there was a dramatic change in his production following week 13 of the 2022 season. Now, if only I could put my finger on why. What could possibly have happened in week 13 of the 2022 season? Joking aside, before week 13, he had only had a total of 4 touchdowns. But after week 13, he scored 7 more, bringing his season season total to 11. But the one thing that he had never been able to achieve in his 6 seasons in the NFL was scoring more than 2 touchdowns in a single game. That was until week 5 of the 2023 season. You see, 3 of the 4 touchdowns that Purdy threw in this game went to one man, George Kittle. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like elevation to me. But who was the other player that Purdy threw to in order to get that 4th touchdown? Just some guy named Kyle Juszczyk. You know, the guy that plays for that well-known receiving position of fullback. All in all, while the Cowboys were able to put up 161 passing yards of offense, the Niners surpassed that, managing to put up 253. And while we're talking about passing, there's another narrative that I wanted to mention briefly that I'll go more in depth about in a future episode. It started with Brock Purdy only throws short yard passes over the middle and lets Debo and Kittle do the rest of the work, which, yeah, that is a big part of the 49ers scheme. That's what they're supposed to do. But many were also adding this to it. He's always throwing to wide open receivers. And I'll be honest with you, there was a point where I believed that myself. There were times that I would sit there and watch games thinking, how is no one around him? To me, it looked easy for Purdy. And then after this game, I stumbled upon a YouTube channel called The QB School. The creator of the channel, JT O'Sullivan, is a former NFL quarterback, and he would break down QB performances, giving very detailed analysis on each relevant play, good or bad. And it was this game and his analysis that really opened my eyes to what Purdy was actually doing. When you're watching football on television, the cameras are trained to follow the ball when it's thrown. But if you actually look at the footage from the All-22 view, then you see the entire play as it's happening. And this is where I learned the term anticipation. Obviously, I knew what the term meant for normal everyday speech, but I didn't realize that it had a slightly different meaning when describing a skill that a quarterback should have. And in watching his breakdown of certain plays of this game, and then rewatching the highlights, it really made me see Purdy in a different light. Some of the throws to Ayuk and Debo were made well before either of them broke out of their respective routes, and that's what's seen on the All-22. But in the highlights from the game, it really does appear that Purdy is throwing to them while they are wide open. I guess it just goes to show you that you can't believe everything you see on TV. Now, not to be outdone on the rushing side of things, both Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason were able to score a touchdown each, though it should be said that CMC was pretty much contained for most of the game. It's interesting though. While I was extremely happy that the Niners dominated the game, the one thing I was looking forward to the most was what the media was finally going to say about Brock Purdy and the Niners offense. And while watching Skip completely melt down over his team yet again,
I wore it during last night's game like it was going to actually bring me some good luck, maybe even him too. This is what I did with it with about 2 minutes left in 49ers 42, Cowboys 10.
You did all that? You waited that long?
Yeah. I thought about throwing Micah's number 11 into the trash also, but I spared him. But now I will not be spared by Richard Sherman and Keyshawn Johnson. Bad morning to you two.
You will not.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to warn both of you.
Please.
Keyshawn always says, you got to slow your roll. I'm going to warn both of you.
Please warn me.
As you well know, it's a long season. It's only just now getting
short,
started.
though, Skip.
I will give you this. The 49ers last night maxed out. I will give you this. We crapped out. They played virtually the best game they can play. There were little things here and there. Brock Purdy missed a couple of throws. He got a couple batted down at the line of scrimmage. But overall, I'm not sure they can play much better than they played last night. All right. Now, here's the point about last night. I knew what my quarterback was and what he wasn't. I've been saying this for 3 years. I keep trying to just barely cling to him, and I just barely hang on. And I go by a New Jersey, and I say, okay, maybe this time he can stay out of the way, and maybe he can get off a little hot, and maybe he can get in some comfort zone, and maybe they can actually run the football around him and take some of the heat and discomfort off him, because he never looks comfortable against San Francisco at all. This is 3 straight losses, the last 2, obviously, the previous 2 in the playoffs. You look at his QBR, it's under 50. It's a very good defense he's up against, but they have his psychological number. He is deer in headlights.
the one thing that was a pleasant surprise was actually what Nick Wright had to say. And while he was still far away from becoming a Purdy fan, knowing that he could be relatively objective was a nice surprise.
The exercise I ask people to do when Niners are in a standalone game is take out a little piece of paper, have the column, wows and yikes. Wow throws, give it a check mark. Yikes throws, give it a check mark. And so I did it last night. Brock Purdy last night, 5 wows, 1 yikes. Okay. He was excellent. Brock Purdy last night, fair is fair. I said all week I wanted to see him do it against the defensive caliber of the Cowboys. I am not now going to sit up here and be like, well, actually, the Cowboys defense isn't quite as good. I'm not going to do that. Maybe they're not the best defense in football like I thought, but they didn't lose Micah before the game or DeMarcus Lawrence. The Cowboys defense, he was excellent. Yeah. There is the first touchdown to Kittle was a great play where he breaks out of the pocket. He had a couple other really nice ones.
With a 10th regular season win under his belt, Purdy was truly looking like one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and it was looking like the Cinderella story of Mr. Irrelevant was headed toward a very happy ending. But the unfortunate part of any Cinderella story is that eventually that clock has to strike midnight. It's interesting. The tricky thing about making this particular series, especially right before the 2024 draft, is that many people already know this story, or at least they think they do. But I can't lie. When I was outlining the series and splitting up the season into parts, I did not want to make this episode. It's not that I couldn't accept the fact that this was a dark time to be a Purdy fan. It's that I knew it was going to be difficult to add context and nuance to this particular stretch of games because a lot of people had already made up their mind. They had already decided that they were going to completely forget the previous 13 games before it. They were going to forget him coming in for an injured Jimmy Garoppolo in Week 13 to lead the Niners to victory. They were going to forget him making his NFL debut by starting opposite the greatest quarterback to ever play the game and lead the Niners to victory while also losing a major part of the offense. They were going to forget him winning his next 4 games including one of the best games of the season when he led the Niners to an overtime victory. This was after leading the team down the field to set up the game-winning field goal, which the kicker missed. Oh, and they would also forget he did all of that without Deebo Samuel. They would forget that in his first playoff game against a division rival, he and the rest of the offense dropped over 40 points on the opposing defense. They would forget this play. They would forget him leading the team to victory against one of their greatest rivals to move on to the NFC Championship game. They would forget that he did all of that while still being just a rookie. They would forget how hard he worked to rehab a torn UCL so that he could start the first game in his first full NFL season, even though he couldn't have a normal offseason. They would forget how he led the team to a dominant win over the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. They would forget how, in the next 3 games, he would prove to be one of the most efficient passers in the NFL. And they would forget that just a week before, he and the rest of the team destroyed the Dallas Cowboys. They would forget all of that because for the first time in his career, Brock Purdy lost. Now I know, technically, he did start the game against the Eagles in the NFC Championship game, but he was taken out before the team's first drive was even done. And while he is credited with the loss because he started the game, he did not finish the game. Now here was a game that many people thought the Niners were going to win. The Browns didn't have their starting quarterback, but what they did have was the number 1 defense in the league going into this game. And listen, I've always maintained that I could be objective when it came to evaluating Purdy, and that's not going to stop now. He did not play his best in this game. But I think what's lost is that there were a few things that happened in this game that people like to dismiss. First, it was raining.
wait a second, Brock Purdy, what are these numbers? 12 of 27 for a grand total of 125, really? 125 yards? Wait, they went 3 of 12 on third down?
Now, I know that there are quarterbacks that can play well in the rain, but there are also a lot of quarterbacks that don't play well in the rain. Secondly, a few of the 49ers' best weapons on offense had to leave the game due to injury. Deebo Samuel, remember him? He left the game with a shoulder injury. Christian McCaffrey left the game in the third quarter with an oblique injury. Now, for most people, they saw that, then saw the loss, and automatically came to the conclusion that the only reason Purdy lost is because he was without 2 of his major weapons. But here's where a lot of people choose to dismiss this fact. Despite Purdy not playing his best game, he still did the one thing that people had been asking him to do: lead the team on a game-winning drive. Remember what I said earlier about people forgetting? The only difference this time was that when the kick was missed, the team was losing by 2 points. Of course, with that loss, people were finally free to start questioning if Purdy was really as good as people said.
Second, is it possible that the kid that I thought was going Tom Brady fell back to earth with such a thud that it was one of the all-time duds where you say, well, that looked like Iowa State Brock Purdy?
To many people, this proved that Purdy couldn't lead a game-winning comeback. To many people, it proved that the 49ers couldn't win if they were trailing. To many, it proved that Purdy was who they thought he was.
He is who I think most people, before they got a little crazy over the last few days, thought he was. A big question mark, who is the Niners' weak link. Purdy was terrible.
Do you know what people conveniently forget to include in their critiques? The fact that the kicker missed the field goal. And when people would bring it up, it was quickly dismissed.
So, and the thing you did at the beginning of, well, but we're going to blame him for not making the field goal.
Or, my favorite, well, if Purdy didn't play so bad for most of that game, they wouldn't have needed a field goal to win.
The drive.
What I'm saying is he was 12 of 27 for 125. Mm-hmm. If he makes or misses that field goal, he played terribly in that game.
The fact remained that Purdy and the Niners lost their first regular season game since he started, and they were hoping that things would get better when they traveled to Minnesota to take on the Vikings. Things, in fact, did not get better. They got worse. First, while CMC was back in the game, Trent Williams would end up being out from an injury he sustained the previous week. And second, Purdy would end up throwing 2 interceptions on back-to-back drives, leading to a loss of 17-22. And here, once again, people were not giving the full facts of what most likely led to that loss, or they would continue to dismiss the context and the nuances of it. You see, Purdy, up until a specific play, had actually been playing fairly well. But during the fourth quarter, the Niners went for a quarterback sneak, and this resulted in Purdy taking a nasty helmet-to-helmet shot that sent his head backward. After the game, Shanahan would inform media that Purdy showed concussion symptoms and would be going through the concussion protocol. But it was after this play, immediately in fact, that Purdy would throw his first interception, throwing just a bit too high and missing Juwan Jennings. Normally, I would be sitting here telling you that it was a bad pass, but he'd been playing clean the entire game, gets his head knocked off, and then immediately throws 2 back-to-back interceptions. Yeah, I'm gonna give him a pass, no pun intended. But the fact was, the Niners now had lost 2 games in a row. Deebo and Trent were still out with injuries, and the media was having a field day with his perceived downfall. It almost seemed like they were happy that he was, quote, turning back into a pumpkin.
Not only is he not the MVP of the league, not only is he not the MVP of the team, he is actually the opposite of the most valuable player on the team. He is their weakest link.
So had a number 1 seed for sure.
So I got a what if for you.
For sure.
What if Brock Purdy, young quarterback, Mr. Irrelevant, last pick in the draft out of Iowa State, what if he starts to lose a little confidence? Because once a young quarterback loses confidence in this league, it just drains out of his body as fast as anything you've ever seen, where you just suddenly can't find yourself. You can't figure out who was I? What just happened to me?
And unfortunately, it wasn't over yet. After being cleared to play the following week, Purdy and the Niners would be facing Joe Burrow and the Bengals. And if you were to look at the stat sheet, here's what you would see. He hit 22 out of 31 passes for a 71% completion rate. He threw for 365 yards, which worked out to a yards per attempt of 11.8. On the rushing side, believe it or not, he actually led the team in yards with 57. Yes, McCaffrey rushed for 54 yards and a touchdown, but to have Purdy as the lead rusher pressure had never happened up until that point. But you see, the problem comes when you look at the fact that he only threw for 1 touchdown and 2 interceptions. There is no way to sugarcoat it. Despite all the rest of the stats, those 2 interceptions on crucial drives really did hurt the team as a whole. And because he had been cleared to play, using the excuse of a concussion really wasn't 100% valid. Joe Burrow simply outplayed him. I think that if he hadn't thrown those 2 interceptions, the backlash wouldn't have been as harsh, but because he did, he was seen as the main reason the Niners lost that game. And whether you believe that or not, the media was giving him zero leeway.
Okay, listen, I mean, I'm not trying to be obnoxious here, but I guess I am. It's exactly what I told you would happen. But hold on, the moment he doesn't have the perfect weapons, the moment he's not playing with a lead, he's not league MVP Brock Purdy. He's not pretty good, Brock Purdy. He's a millstone around their neck, Brock Purdy.
Thankfully, Week 8 was the final game that the Niners would play before their bye week. Trust me, it was needed. Changes needed to be made, and they only had a week to do it. Unfortunately, after the bye week, they'd be taking on one of the hottest teams in the league who were going into their bye week on a 5-game winning streak. And as it happened, the team being led by the last pick in the draft would be going up against a team being led by the first pick in the draft. Number 1 versus number 262. What was at stake? Well, for some, it was Brock Purdy's job. One of the things I told myself when I started this series was this: no matter what happens, stay objective. If Purdy does well, call it out. But if Purdy does bad, call it out just as much. In the last episode, I didn't try to hide the fact that as a team, the Niners lost 3 straight games. But what I wasn't going to do was lay the blame directly at Purdy's feet. Purdy was being blamed for every loss, so much so that he was being referred to as the Niners' weak link. Time for some objectivity. In the Browns game, he wasn't the same Purdy as we had seen, and he didn't have a great game. But he drove the team down the field, set them up in good position to win the game with a field goal, but the kicker just missed. In the Vikings game, he played well, but then likely suffered a concussion on a quarterback sneak and then threw 2 interceptions and the Niners lost. And then in the Bengals game, Purdy didn't play as great as the stats would suggest, although he still played decent considering that he was most likely still recovering from that hit he took in the previous week. But would I lay the blame directly at Purdy's feet for all 3 of those losses? No, of course not. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that for the past few episodes, I've been using soundbites from Nick Wright. There's a reason for that. It directly ties into the first part of this episode, because you see, Nick Wright is a huge fan of Trevor Lawrence.
Yes, I would rather have him than Josh Allen. I would, and I think that will become more conventional wisdom as the year plays on. But I just the other day we did a whole Justin Herbert needs to be better and Wilds is quarterback wins guy, and then threw out there that Trevor's not ahead of Justin Herbert. I just don't understand how to square that.
At one point during the season, I asked myself, why do you continue to watch this show? Wright is obviously biased, his takes are so out there they should be considered nothing but rage bait, and he is causing you to question your own beliefs about a quarterback that you really like. So why? And then this game happened, and it all made sense. But let's put a pin in that for a second. The Jaguars were coming into Week 10 on a 5-game winning streak, while the Niners were coming into Week 10 on a 3-game losing streak. The momentum was squarely in the corner of the Jaguars. Now, I realized that at the end of last episode, I mentioned that it would be number 1 versus number 262. And yes, I know that this actually happened in Week 2 when the Niners went against the Rams, but the reason I brought it up specifically for this game was because Lawrence was drafted a year before Purdy. So this game was actually featuring 2 young quarterbacks with similar NFL experience. And while many people were picking the Niners to win this game, there were others that gave the Niners no chance to win. Coming into this game on a 3-game skid, it was understandable that the Niners would not be looked at as the favorites to win this game. Why? Because people didn't care about the 8 games prior to this or what stats were produced. They saw 5-game winning streak versus 3-game losing streak. They saw superstar first overall pick versus 7th round Mr. Irrelevant. So let's take that pin back out now, because the reason why I continue to watch a show like First Things First, where one of the hosts went out of their way to continuously discredit Brock Purdy and give him zero chance to win, was because I thoroughly enjoyed watching the show after games like this one, because not only did the Niners beat the Jaguars, they dismantled them. Let's start with the defense, because up until this point, I haven't really talked about them much. In my defense, this is a series specifically about Purdy, but I feel like the defense deserves their credit because they shut down Trevor Lawrence. Multiple sacks and 2 interceptions, and they were able to keep the team to only 3 points. For a defense that had given up 31 points 2 weeks prior to this to the Bengals, they looked like a dominant force and only gave up a single field goal all game. But that offense looked exactly like the team that had dominated the first 5 weeks of the season, and while it may not have been as satisfying as 42-10 against the Cowboys, 34-3 came in a close second. Now, I think we need to talk about something, because a lot of people were fixated on a certain play, and for good reason. But I can almost guarantee it's probably not the play you think it's going to be. Let's make no mistake. Purdy's touchdown to Kittle is one of the most amazing throws I have ever seen. The pocket was almost completely collapsed, which meant he had no space to step into that throw. So the fact that he was even able to throw it is crazy in and of itself. And then to watch it land directly into Kittle's arms while he was in stride, allowing him to get into the end zone untouched, simply amazing. But no, it was actually the first touchdown that I wanted to highlight. Now, anyone who knows anything about football knows that it was one of the worst decisions that Purdy's ever made. I mean, both him and Shanahan both said as much during the press conference after the game.
On Purdy's first touchdown pass, was that like a no-no guess?
Yeah, that was honestly one of, I can say this because he played his ass, played well, but that was like one of his worst decisions I think he's made since he's been here. And it took me a while to get over it. I thanked him for the touchdown. But that was not a good decision, and he was fortunate with it. But he made a lot of really good plays, and if you are going to make a bad decision, and it's still a touchdown, in the grand scheme of things, he can tell me it was a real good decision. But I know we can't. He knows that. He knows what he did wrong, but Ayuk made him right.
Can you walk us through what you saw on the first touchdown and how it played out?
Yeah, I mean, it was just a normal keeper that we had up. I got the edge. I just felt like I had a lot of time. The smart decision was probably just, continue to run, try to get as many yards as I can instead of, putting the ball up like I did. But I saw BA in the back of the end zone sort of run space, George as well, and I just put it up towards the back, and BA came down with it. But yeah, I'm not necessarily proud of that play, honestly. I mean, yes, it was a touchdown and everything, great. BA made a great play, but I got to be smart with the ball, and if anything, I should have ran the ball. So.
Kyle termed it among your worst decisions.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. I agree. So, yeah.
What I take issue with is some people's insistence that it was a bad throw. A bad decision? Absolutely. But a bad throw? Absolutely not. Why do I say that? Well, look at this. Now, look at this. It's the exact same type of throw he's made before, and each time has resulted in a touchdown. Of course, the difference this time was that he was throwing across his body, which was, in fact, the bad decision. Now, some people, like good old Skip, will insist that the throw was meant for George Kittle.
That he tried to throw a jump ball to Kittle. Like this is desperate. He tries to go Brett Favre. I'm just going to throw it up for grabs.
Are we sure he wasn't throwing to Ayuk?
No.
Or we just want to say it's Kittle? Because Kittle was in front. That ball was mighty high for it to go to Kittle.
He threw it up for Kittle, and look what I found.
I think you're reaching there, Skip, but I'm going to let you reach.
But if you look at where the ball landed, that pass was 100% meant for Brandon Ayuk. In fact, I don't believe Kittle was even supposed to be there, because if he had jumped even just a little bit higher, that ball probably ends up getting batted away, and there's no touchdown. Who would have taken the blame? Brock Purdy. Again, poor decision, but Purdy, by this point in his career, was known for the touch he put on the ball. The intention was for the pass to go to Ayuk, and the ball landed in Ayuk's arms. That pass was perfect. Speaking of perfect, you may have noticed that the title of this episode was called Bounce Back Perfection. To those of you watching who are Niners fans, you know exactly what game came after this one. For those of you who are watching that aren't fans or newer fans, the game after this one just so happened to be against a very special team. When we think about moments in careers, often we think about what a player does rather than who they're playing against. For Brock Purdy, I believe that him and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers will always be intertwined throughout the rest of his career. His first official NFL start was against the Bucs, and in that game, he put up a passer rating of 134, and in that victory, became the only rookie in his first start to, quote, defeat Tom Brady. You all know how I really feel about that though. Almost 1 year later, Brock Purdy would once again face off against the Bucs and accomplish something that hadn't been done on the 49ers since Joe Montana and Steve Young both did it in 1989.
In a franchise that features arguably, not to me, not to you, but arguably, the GOAT,
quarterback,
Joe Montana, and another Hall of Famer, Steve Young, Brock Purdy became the only quarterback in Niners history to have a perfect passer rating when throwing more than 20 passes.
Oh, yeah.
That's special.
Brock Purdy was perfect. How did he do it? 20 completions on 25 attempts, 333 yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. But that wasn't what stuck out to me in this game. What really stuck out to me in this game was the growing connection that Purdy had with both George Kittle and especially Brandon Ayuk. See, I believe that since he'd helped McCaffrey back in 2022, their connection was there from day one. But over the past 15 games or so that he had started on the team, his connection with Kittle and Ayuk had grown by leaps and bounds, and that really presented itself fully in the last 2 games. In the game against the Jaguars, Purdy connected with Ayuk on that beautiful 13-yard pass in the end zone, and then connected with Kittle on that deep 66-yard touchdown with a collapsing pocket. And in this game, Purdy connected with Kittle on a simple 3-yard pass in the end zone, but prior to that connected with Ayuk on a deep 76-yard touchdown that was, at the time, the longest touchdown of the season, which of course was beaten shortly afterward by Josh Allen, who had an 80-yard touchdown. But for just that moment, Purdy was king. But the connection he was continuing to develop with Ayuk would become very important, as after this game, the Niners would once again travel to Seattle for Thanksgiving. Now, I don't want to undervalue this game at all, because in terms of the story, the game was sort of a revenge game for the Niners. And in any other circumstances, this would have been a great test for Purdy and the Niners to see if they could continue their winning streak. The only problem, though, was that this game happened in Week 12, and fans didn't care about Week 12. And really, in regards to the Niners, the media didn't care about Week 12 either. Why? Because 10 months earlier, the Philadelphia Eagles took Brock Purdy out of the NFC Championship and ended the Niners' playoff run. You see, nobody cared about Week 12 because in Week 13, the Niners would be going back to the link to prove to the Eagles, to prove to the media, and to prove to themselves who really should have won that game. I knew this game was coming. Shoot, every 49er fan knew this game was coming. I'm betting a lot of fans saw the schedule, looked for this specific game, circled it, and waited. It didn't matter who the team faced on the way to this game. This was the game that truly mattered to most of the fan base. And for good reason. We all know the story. We all know what happened. And quite honestly, we all know what happened when the game started. After a horrendous first quarter that saw the Niners have a grand total of -6 yards, the Niners put their foot on the gas and never looked back. 42-19. Nothing more really needs to be said about it, except that wouldn't really make for a very good video. And so I thought about how I was going to continue the story of Brock Purdy in a meaningful way. And the inspiration actually came to me while I was watching some videos for research, and consequently also provided me with a name for this title. Because if we really wanted to be honest with ourselves, Purdy, even after the drama of the NFC Championship game, wasn't even the main story of this game. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he really wasn't the main factor in why the game went the way that it did. That's not to say that he wasn't important, far from it actually. People, for reasons unknown, don't want to admit it, but Purdy was actually the most important player on the field that day. I mean, we all saw what happened when he was taken out in the NFC Championship, and if you just looked at the stats, you'd probably be getting ready to tell me to get my head checked. How could I possibly see 19-27, 314 yards, 4 touchdowns, and a 148 passer rating, and then say he wasn't the main factor? You see, 2 episodes I made a claim. He would prove to be one of the most efficient passers in the NFL. Now, if you were to look at Purdy's 2 touchdowns to Deebo Samuel, you would see this: a 48-yard pass and a 46-yard pass. Except if you dug down into those touchdowns, you'd see that both of those passes were probably 5 to 10-yard passes that Deebo then took and made plays on. You know, like he's paid to do. Why am I bringing this up? Because even though the Niners dominated the Eagles, this was one of the games that many people used to show why Purdy didn't deserve to be called the MVP or to even be in the conversation. Put simply, Purdy wasn't the reason they won this game, but he didn't have to be.
Does he deserve
to be the favorite. He is. No. Guys, we all watched a lot of football yesterday.
4 touchdowns. Very good.
Hold on. Hey, everybody can see the numbers.
Well, I'm just saying.
But luckily, we also get to watch the games. Was Brock Purdy the best player on his team yesterday?
No, Debo.
No, Debo was. Brock Purdy got, perfect passer rating and about 100 yards of passing on these and 2 touchdowns on these 2 Debo plays. And again, he's doing his job, and we can show you the 2 Debo plays. He's doing his job, and I'm not knocking him. This is, again, we've jumped the shark where it's not about, you guys could have probably checkmated me if you guys just wanted to say, hey, Nick, ready to admit Purdy's a little better than you thought? I'd probably have to admit that.
Let's take a trip all the way back to week 14 when Purdy made his first NFL start. I know, I use this game a lot, but this game was crucial to Purdy's story. In that game, Purdy threw for 2 touchdowns. One was that 27-yard pass to Christian McCaffrey, and the other was that 32-yard pass to Ayuk. CMC was heading into the end zone and had 1 yard after catch, while Ayuk caught the ball at the 5 and took it in from there. 59 combined yards, but only 6 of them were yards after the catch. Those 2 deep shots, combined with his 10-yard rush, that's what won them that game. So again, why am I bringing this up? Because once again, people simply refuse to apply any sort of context or nuance to the Purdy discussion. There's a phrase that I've heard multiple times from multiple quarterbacks: take what the defense gives you. In the past 3 games, Purdy took a deep shot in each of them. In each of those games, the defense presented Purdy with opportunities to drive the ball down the field, and each deep throw resulted in a touchdown. In this game, the defense presented Purdy an opportunity to get the ball to his main playmaker of the game, Deebo Samuel. And none of those throws were deep because it didn't have to be. It wasn't about being flashy. It was about being efficient. Purdy had shown in the previous 3 games that he wasn't afraid to air the ball out when he needed to. But in this game, there was no point because it was easier and more efficient to attack the weakest part of the defense. Never before has the phrase, work smarter, not harder, been more appropriate. But, of course, people in the media have selective amnesia when it comes to certain players. So let's do an experiment. Here are the yardage and yak numbers for 2 separate quarterbacks for 12 games. This does include this game. Here's quarterback 1 and here's quarterback 2. Through 12 games, both quarterbacks had similar yards, but quarterback 1 had less yards after catch, and their percentage of yak in regards to their total yards was a little above 48%, while quarterback 2 had more yak, and their percentage of yak was a little over 9.5% more than quarterback 1. And even though quarterback 1 happened to be Purdy, he was the one being labeled a quote, yak merchant, while being discredited because of all the yak yards that he was racking up, while quarterback 2 not only had more yak yards by this point in the season, but more than half of his yards were after the catch. But nothing was being said about it. I guess that's what happens when your name is Patrick Mahomes. And the sad part is, people will hear me mention that name and immediately think I'm saying Purdy is better than Mahomes and completely dismiss everything I said rather than trying to dispute it. Such is life. And I get it. Biases. Some people watching this might be quick to point out that I'm doing the same thing. I'm being biased toward Purdy and using stats to back up my argument when stats only tell part of the story. And the thing is, yeah, I am using stats to back up my argument, and stats do only tell one side of the story, but these stats were being used to tell the whole story of this game and why Purdy didn't deserve any of the credit for the Niners winning this game. I mentioned before that Purdy wasn't the main factor as to why the Niners won this game, but he was the most important part of it, because for all of the yards that Deebo ran after he caught the ball, for all of the yards that George Kittle ran after he caught the ball, for all of the yards that Christian McCaffrey ran after he caught the ball, and for all the yards that Juwan Jennings ran after he caught the ball, for all of those yards to be run, someone had to make the decision when and where to throw that football. Purdy didn't have to throw the ball far because the defense told him he didn't have to. Purdy didn't have to throw the ball far because he knew all he had to do was get the ball in Deebo's hands and he could do what he did best. Purdy didn't have to throw the ball far because he didn't need to prove that he could. He had already done that multiple times before this game. People just chose to willfully ignore it and underestimate him. And what happens when you underestimate someone? 42-19. The Niners proved who the better team was that night and immediately looked to the next game, putting the Eagles squarely in their rearview mirror. And ahead of them, two division rivals that stood between them and the NFC West Championship. And the Niners were ready for a fight. Hold on. You didn't really think that I was going to go this entire video without talking about that play, did you? What kind of Niner fan would I be if I didn't talk about that play? And we all know what play I'm talking about. But for those of you who don't, to put it bluntly, Diamador Lenore turned the link into his Horcrux when he cast his own version of Avada Kedavra on DeAndre Swift.
It's over the middle. Oh my goodness.
Now, before we begin, I wanted to take a quick trip back to Week 12. I know I said I didn't want to undervalue that game, and I meant it. Back in Week 2, the Niners beat the Rams in their first divisional game. Then in Week 4, they beat the Cardinals to win their second. And finally, in Week 12, they would win their third. All three divisional opponents had faced the Niners at least once, and Seattle would be the first team to face them a second time. In the first game, off of a tip pass, Purdy would end up throwing the first pick six of his career, but he didn't let that dictate the rest of the game, and he still managed to put the game away after making the choice to throw a deep strike to what was becoming one of his favorite targets, Brandon Ayuk. A lot of people, including the coach, didn't think that ball was even going to be thrown to him, but Shanahan admitted after the game that it was one heck of a throw and then said something very interesting.
Very rarely does he check it down and you tell him he missed the deep one. He looks at it that way. Actually, he proved to us while the ball was in there it was the right decision.
Of the many narratives that the media and fans of other teams like to put at the forefront, the one that stuck out to me the most was that Purdy liked to rely on checkdowns. And sure, when you have one of the best running backs in the league at your disposal, the checkdown is a safe option. And in this play, right out of the coach's mouth, the safe decision was to actually check it down.
Nice reaction to Brock's touchdown pass there, kind of a little fist bump. What was your emotions watching that throw, watching that play?
I couldn't believe he was throwing it. The zone coverages guys were so deep, and which usually you can check it down right underneath them and get about 12, but Brock thought he could drop it in over the guy, and it was a clear view for all of us, and it was just a hell of a throw.
So if Purdy relied too heavily on the check down, why didn't he do it then? And see, here's the thing. If you've watched every episode of this series and have been paying attention, I've already answered that. Purdy, on the other hand, at any given time, at least in his first 9 games, if you really want to count the NFC Championship, didn't have just one main target. He had, if you count Kyle Juszczyk and Juwan Jennings, 6 different players he could throw to at any time, as long as it wasn't a run play. But if you wanted to see a visual answer to that question, then let's head to the game in Week 14. In the second quarter, the Niners were driving down the field relatively well. But after Purdy saw a tiny mistake by one of the safeties, he made a choice. Purdy launches the ball and hits Deebo while he's in stride for the easy touchdown. So, what does that have to do with the question I asked earlier? Well, for that, let's hear it straight from the sources themselves. Here's Deebo after the game.
A couple weeks ago that you guys had made it a priority to get the deep ball going in the offseason. How do you think that's coming along, and how did it come together for you today?
You know, it's crazy as we worked that play at practice. That was like the last option to be thrown. And so, you know, Brock just being the quarterback he is, and just whenever he sees something, he's just going to let it go. As you can see, like, I really wasn't running like 100 miles per hour. But once I looked back and seen Brock getting ready to cock and throw it, I had to speed up. But that's just something that we work on every year in camp, and we slowly progressing to get better at it.
And here's Purdy.
On the deep pass in practice, he wasn't the usual option on that. What did you see on that? Why did you do it?
Yeah, I saw Jamal Adams he didn't come down like really, really hard, but I sort of saw his feet, you know, like coming down. He was sort of flat-footed, and I was like, all right, with Deebo moving, I was like, we can get over the top here. And so took my drop. He wasn't necessarily like the number one guy in the read. It was actually Juwan. But the way Jamal Adams came down, I was like, this could be a big one. So let it rip and let Debo get under it.
Now, by this point in the season, I was already a Purdy fan, but after hearing from Debo himself that he was the last read in the progression and didn't think he was getting the ball, it solidified the respect that I had for Purdy because of how quickly he made the choice to give Debo the shot because he knew Debo had the edge. He trusted his playmaker to make the play. And if Purdy relies too heavily on checkdowns, then that might have been the biggest checkdown in NFL history. And the crazy thing is, that wasn't even his only deep shot, as later in the third quarter, he would once again find Ayuk for a huge gain that would eventually lead into another touchdown. Purdy's efficiency was on full display in this game. But there was one other thing that I wanted to touch on, because one of the things that would make itself known after this game was Purdy being able to use his legs, even if people didn't notice it at first. You see, in a blink and you miss it moment, during the first play of the game, McCaffrey would take off on a 72-yard run that almost ended in a touchdown. But something would happen that would basically go unnoticed and really wasn't talked about except by Niner fans. You see, people talk about this moment because of the fact that Brandon Ayuk ran with him and made two crucial blocks that allowed McCaffrey to get as far as he did. But watch what happens when McCaffrey is tackled. Did you notice anything? You know, like the player who was immediately there to pick McCaffrey up? Let's see that from a different angle. See, I fully believe that Purdy was trying to catch up to make a block of his own to get McCaffrey into the end zone, and to the relief of many fans, he was a second behind. But the fact that he was the first one down there to pick him up after a 70-yard run was impressive, and it really started to call into question this idea that Purdy didn't know how to run or use his legs. He made the effort to get down the field to help his teammate in any way he could. And while we're on the topic of effort, that brings me back to Debo's first touchdown. Debo himself said that he wasn't running at 100% until he looked back and saw Brock ready to throw. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know anything about what a football player goes through when the ball is snapped. But for some people, Debo's efforts on plays where he wasn't getting the ball was being called into question. But let's go ahead and put a pin in that for now. After sweeping the Seahawks with a 16-28 win, the Niners will move on to Arizona with one goal: sweep the Cardinals and claim the title of NFC West champions for the second season in a row. Purdy would be playing in his home state of Arizona for the first time since being drafted, and would be playing opposite Kyler Murray for the first time as well. Once again, it would be number 1 versus number 262. Now, with the way both teams had been playing, and given their meeting in week 4, the Niners were the clear favorites, and they would end up dominating once again with a final score of 45-29. But how they got to that score really showcased how much of a complete team they actually were. Let's start with the defense. Even though the run defense was not great, and to be fair, they were missing 2 of their starting defensive tackles in this game, they still managed to disrupt the passing game enough, managing to snag 2 interceptions, including a pick 6. But it was the offense that showed once again why they were one of the most dominating offenses in the league. Let's start with CMC. In week 4, he had 4 total touchdowns, and in this game he had 3, becoming the first player since 2013 to score at least 7 touchdowns against a single team in the same season. And while his rushing touchdown was par for the course, it was his 2 receiving touchdowns that garnered some well-deserved attention. Now, the first touchdown didn't seem like anything special, but it really showcased just how fast Purdy was processing the game and going through his reads. The time it takes from the moment he receives a snap to the moment he finds McCaffrey in the end zone is 2 seconds. Regardless if you believe that it was a simple throw or it was a throw that any competent quarterback could make, the fact remains that it was an incredible progression, especially if you look at the play from behind. If you watch his head, he immediately sees that every receiver on the right side is covered and then sees McCaffrey and lets it go. And then there's his second touchdown. One of the things I found funny about this touchdown actually came from Nick Wright.
Any team in football because they set it up so well.
And we saw the play we showed, we can show it again, and this is, everyone thinks I'm going to try to bash Purdy. I'm not bashing Purdy here, but this is what he's talking about. This is a Kyle Shanahan touchdown.
I know, but you didn't think that was a good play from Brock Purdy?
No, I thought it was a good play from Brock Purdy. But the most impressive part of that play is that Christian McCaffrey, the most dangerous player on the field, can be so open that he can fall down, get up, and still be untouched into the end zone.
While I would agree that McCaffrey being that open has more to do with the design of the play itself, here's Purdy describing what actually happened.
The next one to McCaffrey, the deep one, he was also very wide open. Is that one where you are trying not to miss him? Like, do you have to, when someone's that open, like,
Yeah.
gauge a little different?
Yeah, I mean, it was, sort of just like a off-schedule play, a bounce out of the pocket, and then I see him go down the field. And at that point, I didn't know, is he going to, continue to run straight? Is he turning to me? And so I just sort of put it up in the air. And, man, he did a good job tracking it down, catching it, and then getting up and scoring. So sort of a tough, moment right then and there of what to do with where the ball should be. But we got it done.
And if you're asking yourself, how is McCaffrey able to be that open, then all you need to do is look at the play again from a different angle. Number 34 looked like he was responsible for staying with CMC, but as soon as he sees that Purdy has escaped the pocket, he stays back to stop him, and by the time he realizes that Purdy is throwing the ball, it's already too late. Now, this is just my interpretation, obviously, and I could be completely wrong. But it showcased the reality that as good of a player as McCaffrey is, and he is, it took two players to make that play special. So, remember that pin from earlier? What's interesting is that this set of plays I'm going to talk about appear to be the complete opposite of the last set. Because as amazing as that second touchdown pass to Debo was, it's actually the first touchdown pass that I couldn't believe actually happened. Why? Because Debo Samuel was completely unguarded. He was so unguarded that he appeared to jog right into the end zone. And then he spoke after the game, and my mind was blown.
Man, the crazy thing is we practiced that, and in my head I'm like, yo, no way, like this is going to be this wide open. But I came around and seen nobody, and Cal put that in, and normally when he puts stuff in, it works.
Were you supposed to kind of just be, acting like you weren't a big part of that?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely was part of the play of going across and not being as fast to draw a little attention and just be lazy a little bit, and it worked.
Now look, no one will ever truly know whether or not Debo was acting unmotivated or not, but one thing is for sure, if Shanahan used that perceived laziness against the defense and scored off of it, it was a masterful move. I mean, we're talking chess versus checkers here. Now, obviously a play like that was only ever going to work once, but in that moment, it showed that you could never take this offense lightly and that every single player needed to be accounted for, even the quarterback. Because these games showed an aspect of Purdy's game that continued to go under the radar that would eventually lead to great things. But that comes later. First though, after clinching the NFC West, the Niners would head back home to face their toughest challenge yet. At this point in the season, the Niners were 11-3 and had moved into the number 1 seed position for the NFC. But on Christmas night, the number 1 seed from the AFC, the 11-3 Baltimore Ravens, were coming to town. Alright, let's rip the band-aid off right away. This was a bad game. There are no excuses, there are no explanations, the game was bad. In fact, I'll go ahead and I'll confess something now. I've never seen this game from start to finish, and I've never really watched the highlights either. I mean, it was Christmas night, I was spending time with friends, and every time I checked on the game, it seemed to get worse and worse as the night went on. It's almost impossible to come back from 4 interceptions, regardless of who was at fault for each of them. And I've also never watched the talking head shows after the game either, because I knew what each of them was going to say. Brock Purdy lost them the game. Brock Purdy was taken out late in the game when it was out of hand, and some people will say that he got benched because of the 4th interception. Some will say that he was taken out of the game because of the stinger he sustained in the Cardinals game from the week prior. And officially that's the reason that Shanahan gave, and who were we to argue with the coach? But regardless, it doesn't matter. They lost. Purdy looked bad. End of story. Now, like in episode 4, I wasn't sure how to tackle this particular moment in the season. I didn't want this episode to be negative, especially given the fact that it was Christmas, so I decided to remain positive. And I thought, how about we go over all the narratives that Purdy so far had put to rest in a lot of people's minds. Narrative number 1, Purdy doesn't elevate the team elevates Purdy. People like to point out that before Purdy, the San Francisco 49ers were doing just fine with Jimmy G. In fact, they like to point out that it didn't matter who the quarterback even was, the system did all the work. Before Purdy started, George Kittle only had 4 touchdowns, and after Purdy started, his production would increase dramatically and would finish the season with 11, a career best. To put that into perspective, he scored more touchdowns in a 4-game span after Purdy started than he did in any singular regular season since being drafted in 2017, coming close in 2021 with 6. And then when you look at 2023, he once again had 6 touchdowns, and 3 of those came in the same game against the Cowboys, something he had never done before. That was until Purdy became the starting quarterback. But that's just Kittle, which brings me to narrative number 2. Purdy is the dink and dunk quarterback. Anyone can throw the ball 5 yards to Deebo Samuel and have him take it to the end zone. Nothing is going to touch Deebo's 2021 season in terms of production. The main difference between that season and 2023 is that after Purdy started, Samuel actually had more receiving touchdowns than he did rushing. He carried the ball less, and with Purdy being able to stretch the field vertically better than Garoppolo, Deebo found himself being more of a traditional receiver, especially in the later games of the season where he was responsible for some pretty deep touchdowns that didn't rely on his yak ability. And of course that leads me to number 3. Purdy relies too heavily on checkdowns and can't throw deep. I realize I went over this last episode, so I won't rehash all of that. Instead, I wanted to point directly to Brandon Ayuk, who I mentioned was becoming Purdy's best deep threat. In fact, Ayuk was having the best season of his career in 2023, managing to achieve 100+ receiving yards in 6 games, including the Ravens game, up to this point in the season. That included a career-high 156 yards in his game against the Bucs. That should come as no surprise, given that he had that 76-yard touchdown in that game. Speaking of checkdowns, that brings me to the last narrative that I wanted to speak on that had gained traction as the season progressed. Brock Purdy can't be the MVP of the league. He's not even the MVP of his own team. Christian McCaffrey is. You may have noticed in the last episode that I pointed out specifically McCaffrey's touchdowns in both Cardinals games, and for those who were really paying attention, you may have also noticed that I've never actually discussed the fact that McCaffrey was on his way to breaking the record for most consecutive games with a touchdown until the Jags game when he wasn't able to get that 18th TD. And the reason is because I didn't want to take away from what Purdy was doing until the time came to talk about it. While 2019 would be his best year for total yardage, managing to put up 2,300 total yards, he would manage to achieve another season with 2,000+ yards in 2023, but it would be his touchdowns that solidified his true worth, as he would tie for the most touchdowns in the league with 21. This would eventually earn him the honor of being the 2023 Offensive Player of the Year. And while his receiving yards would be about half of what they were in 2019, his receiving touchdowns would actually increase from 4 to 7, giving him the distinction of being the running back with the most receiving touchdowns in 2023. But here's the thing. I don't believe it was a coincidence that each of these players had career-high numbers after Purdy started at quarterback. You can call it the system, but the fact is that someone has to be able to run that system to its absolute best, and no other quarterback had ever run Kyle Shanahan's system as good as Purdy had, and one bad game wasn't going to change that. It's said that the mark of a true champion isn't what happens when they're knocked down, but how they get up and move ahead, and it just so happened that after being knocked down in the worst possible way, Brock would get up and move ahead in the best possible way. One of the things I wanted to focus on for this season was how the media was shaping the narratives around what Brock Purdy was doing, and after the game against the Ravens, I shut the media out completely because I didn't need the negativity. Knowing what happened in the game was enough. But after the game, I realized that I had to move on and get ready for the next game, much like the Niners did. Despite the loss, they were in the playoffs, and while they weren't the concrete number 1 seed, by the end of week 17, they would know for sure. For Purdy though, the loss against the Ravens crushed any hope of him being named MVP, which, if I'm being honest, I could probably do an entire episode on that whole fiasco, but what I was most interested in was to see if and how Purdy could pick himself up and move on from the loss. Little did I know that by the end of the game against the Commanders, Brock Purdy would not only bounce back from the loss against the Ravens, he would make history in ways that I don't think anyone thought was possible. Let's start with something that was confined to the Niners organization only. When you think about 49ers quarterbacks, 2 names immediately come to mind: Joe Montana and Steve Young. And while Purdy has a very long way to go before he can say he belongs in the same conversation as them in terms of accomplishments, he can lay claim to the one thing that they can't. With the yards that Purdy threw for in the game against the Commanders, it would bring his total passing yards to 4,280, which would end up being a 49er franchise record. And it was notable for 2 reasons. One was that he was able to do it despite the 4 losses the team had, but the more important reason was that he did it in 16 games. Over the past few episodes, I made the choice to start focusing on certain players in addition to Purdy, but it was for a purpose, because I wanted to shed light on the main narrative that had plagued Purdy since he stepped on the field in week 1. Purdy doesn't make the team better, he doesn't elevate them. In the last episode, I broke down how each of 4 players had accomplished things they hadn't yet done in their careers up to this point because they didn't have the right quarterback throwing them the ball. George Kittle had a career-high 3 touchdowns in a single game and a career-high 11 touchdowns in 2022 that only happened after Purdy started. Deebo Samuel, for the first time since he was drafted, was being used more as a wide receiver, managing to have more receiving touchdowns than rushing touchdowns. Brandon Ayuk became a legitimate deep threat, managing 7 games with 100-plus receiving yards, including a career-high 156-yard game. And Christian McCaffrey, for the first time in his career, had 7 receiving touchdowns, which led the league in running backs and allowed him to tie the league-high 21 total touchdowns. But here's what else they did. With Purdy putting up 4,200-plus passing yards, the 49ers would become the first team since 2004 to have 4 players reach 1,000-plus scrimmage yards. They became the 6th team to do it in NFL history. But there was more to it than first appeared. The other teams to achieve this did so with a combination of a running back and 3 wide receivers. But in the case of the 49ers, they would be the first team in NFL history to accomplish this feat with all 3 skill positions, a running back, 2 wide receivers, and a tight end. In fact, the game ball from Week 17 now sits in the Pro Football Hall of Fame after it was signed by all 4 players. Which begs the question, why had this never happened before, given the fact that any quarterback could be dropped into the 49ers and have success? Well, that's easy. Those 4 players are all pros. Except this is where I think people like to play some revisionist history. Christian McCaffrey, there is no question. He was named first team All-Pro in 2019 in 2 different positions and wouldn't be named an All-Pro again until 2023. George Kittle, again, no question. He was named second team All-Pro in 2018, first team All-Pro in 2019, another second team in 2022, and he would be named first team All-Pro again in 2023. Here's where things get a little dicey. Deebo Samuel would be named first team All-Pro in 2021. What I think is very interesting though, at least when it comes to discussions about Purdy, is that so many people will still hang on to that All-Pro despite the fact that, according to Deebo himself, his 2022 production was not great. And while he still played well in 2023, there was a noticeable decline in his production and effort. And then there's Brandon Ayuk. One of the things that I liked most about the 2023 season was watching the connection between Purdy and Ayuk grow as the season progressed. In fact, it was fitting that Purdy's first and last touchdown of the regular season went to Ayuk. And in those 2 touchdowns, you could see the progression of that connection. In the first game against the Steelers, the throw and catch was your standard run-of-the-mill touchdown. But in the last game that Purdy would play in the regular season, his final touchdown proved how well he could navigate the pocket as it was breaking down and how well he could escape and make something out of nothing. It was that play, plus everything else that Ayuk had done during the season with Purdy, that earned him his first All-Pro of his career. And this is what has always frustrated me about this season as a Purdy fan. I've always maintained the stance that Purdy has benefited from the players around him. But to act like the players around him hadn't benefited from his play was disrespectful to what Purdy was putting on tape each and every game, even the bad ones. In my opinion, after the regular season was over, Purdy had, through his stats and his gameplay, answered every single question that had ever been asked to him up until this point. Except for one.
Are you confident that if the Niners, by some chance, are trailing in the second half of a playoff game, that Purdy won't melt down?
We have 4 games this week. That means we have 8 quarterbacks, 7 terrific quarterbacks, and Brock Purdy. I simply don't put him in the same category as the other quarterback.
When I was creating the schedule for this season, I couldn't wait to get to this episode. And the reason is simple and maybe a little petty. I couldn't wait to get to this episode because there are 2 games many members of the media would love to forget. But before that, let's take a trip back to when this question was asked.
Are you confident that if the Niners, by some chance, are trailing in the second half of a playoff game, that Purdy won't melt down?
See, this question was asked right after Purdy had achieved his perfect passer rating against the Bucs, who made it to the playoffs. This, of course, was 2 weeks before they would go on to destroy the Eagles, who made it to the playoffs. The final score of that game was 42-19, And that was 8 weeks after they had a similar score against the Cowboys, who made it to the playoffs. Of course, this was during their 5-game win streak, and during that stretch, they also defeated the LA Rams, who made it to the playoffs. That was 4 of the teams that the Niners had already beaten during their regular season, and they only had 2 left to face. You see, the Packers were coming off an impressive win against the Cowboys, and the Niners were coming off the bye they had earned by earning the number 1 seed. One concern many fans had was that most of the stars hadn't played a snap of football since week 17. No one knew if rust would play a factor. What did play a factor, though, when the game began, was the rain. In what would become an ongoing criticism against Purdy, he did, admittedly, struggle in the rain. It happened during the Browns game during week 6, and it would appear to affect him in this game as well. And while the weather wasn't ideal, what was even worse was the fact that in the first quarter, Deebo Samuel would go down with a shoulder injury and he wouldn't come back into the game. Despite Deebo going down, Purdy would still manage to find Kittle in the second quarter with a beautiful throw to take the lead. They would lose the lead after the Packers were able to score twice in the third quarter, including a 2-point conversion to go up 21-14. After that, the Niners were able to get a field goal in the fourth quarter, and they would close the gap and make the game 21-17. Up to this point, Purdy had been inaccurate on a lot of his throws, and whether or not that had to do with the weather, or in some cases receivers running the wrong routes, it didn't matter. All of that had to be wiped clean when it came to the final drive. There was 0 room for errors. 12 plays, 7 throws, 5 runs. And of those 5 runs, the final 2 would be the most important. For the entire season, Purdy's ability to scramble out of the pocket when a play would break down would go virtually unnoticed. And in that moment, when the game was on the line, Purdy would make the choice to put the team on his back and get them within 5 yards of the goal, which of course would then set up McCaffrey for the final touchdown of the game, giving the Niners the lead 21-24. This left the Packers a minute left to get into field goal range to tie the game. And for all of the talk about Purdy's almost interceptions, the interception that the media didn't really want to talk about was Jordan Love's game-losing interception when he made the choice to throw the ball back across his body, resulting in Dre Greenlaw getting his second interception of the game. And this is where I have a problem with how people treated this game. No matter what happened at the end, where one quarterback won the game for his team and the other threw the interception that lost the game for his team, the main thing that people talked about was how bad Brock Purdy played for the first 3 quarters of the game.
James Jones, were you impressed by Brock Purdy and the Niners win?
You know, I'm trying not to come across as a hater. You know what I mean?
Try hard.
Because they did.
Be honest.
They did win the game.
Be honest.
No, he did not impress me at all. At all, right?
Oh.
Yes, they won the football game. Yes, you usually tend to win football games when the other team makes mistakes. Yes, right? The Packers, young football team, made mistakes, right? 2 of the best 2 throws Brock Purdy threw to us. Right? We just didn't catch him. If you truly ask me, Brock Purdy for 3.5 quarters was the worst player on the field.
So I watched that game where he did everything I asked him to do at the end, and I came away from it saying, yeah, he's the reason they can't win a Super Bowl. What would it take for me to believe the Niners can win the Super Bowl with Brock Purdy? For that, I need to see at least one real comeback victory. Yeah. I would have thought.
That was one.
Yeah.
Now, I remember also
I'm as shocked
asking
as
you,
anybody.
going into a game, I remember asking you, if Brock Purdy played great throughout the game, you know, like he has many times and they win, would you be more impressed with that? Or if he played poorly and then when it was time, they needed a drive to win it, he delivered the drive. Which one would you be more impressed with? You said the drive.
Yeah.
And that was when I fully realized that no matter what Purdy did, he would never get the respect he had earned from certain media personalities. Even Undisputed wasn't immune to it.
First of all, Skip, you lead in by saying a comeback. Oh, the comeback. Was it really truly a comeback?
Yes.
I mean, in the end, they start the fourth quarter by 7 points. They kick a field goal, so it's really 4. If you really want to call it a comeback. When we all start talking about the San Francisco 49ers being able to come from behind, we're not talking about a 4-point come from behind situation. We're talking about double-digit deficit. I'm talking about 10 points, 12. But that's okay. A win is a win is a win, no matter how you get it. But what I would say is you're dealing with a young team in the Green Bay Packers.
They wanted to see more. They wanted to see Purdy do it from farther behind. They wanted to see it done against a team that wasn't the 7th seed in the playoffs. So, enter the 3-seeded Detroit Lions. What a game. Much like the divisional round, the Niners started off shaky, including a first half interception from Purdy. By the end of the half, it was 24-7. Confession time. I turned the game off at that point. I lay down in bed, ready to go to sleep. And then I got a text from a friend, and everything changed. I got back up, turned on the TV, and suddenly the score was 24-27. I couldn't believe it. So I did what any rational person would do. I rerun the broadcast back to the start of the third quarter to see how it happened. First, I want to start off with this. Luck did play a part in some of this. I won't deny it. But one of the main stories from this game was what was going on with the Lions. Here's the thing though. The mark of a great team is capitalizing on the other team's choices or mistakes. The Lions got to where they were by going for it on 4th down. And for most of the season, it worked and people cheered. In this game, some of those plays didn't work and people booed because the Lions should have gone for the points. Should they have? Sure. But they didn't, and the Niners punished them for those choices. So let's talk about the throw. You know what I'm talking about. Once again, people would talk about the mistake that Purdy made by throwing it, except that play and throw looked awfully familiar. Funny, you know who didn't have a problem with that throw and actually called it the right decision? That's right, Kyle Shanahan.
I mean, they had a safety sitting in the middle of the field. Brock did an awesome job recognizing it. We had Debo on a crossing route, and that safety cut it, and Brock made the right read and just launched it. But the corner did an awesome job staying on top. I mean, the safety cuts, and that means there's no one in the middle, but the corner was aware of it, so he stayed on top. I was worried that for it to be a pick when it's like that. Brock makes the right read, but then he launches it, and BA just did a hell of a job going up for it. So it wasn't going to be a pick, and then he came down with the catch, which was huge. I was never able to see whether he was down or not. They said he was, so it's great we punched it in later.
If you look at the trajectory of that ball versus where Ayuk was headed and the speed at which he was going, that is an easy catch for him and most likely would have resulted in the touchdown anyway. But to the defender's credit, he made a good call and was able to get in front of Ayuk to try and make a play for it. Now, I'm not going to talk about the flag. Some people say it would have been DPI, some say there was no foul regardless of whether a catch is made or not, and that the flag was not needed. Either way, after the ball somehow managed to bounce off the face mask of the defender, Ayuk made one of the craziest catches I've ever seen. And just a few plays later, Purdy and Ayuk would show off that connection by once again scoring a touchdown. After another mistake by the Lions, the ball would be fumbled and the Niners would recover. And here we come to the payoff of something I mentioned a few episodes ago. But watch what happens when McCaffrey is tackled. Did you notice anything? You know, like the player who was immediately there to pick McCaffrey up? Let's see that from a different angle. See, I fully believe that Purdy was trying to catch up to make a block of his own to get McCaffrey into the end zone. And to the relief of many fans, he was a second behind. But the fact that he was the first one down there to pick him up after a 70-yard run was impressive. And it really started to call into question this idea that Purdy didn't know how to run or use his legs. He made the effort to get down the field to help his teammate in any way he could. After getting the ball back, Purdy would make the first of 3 runs to extend the drives that would end up leading to retaking the lead. There is a part of me that wonders though, if Debo hadn't gotten in the way accidentally, would Purdy have made it into the end zone on that run? The world will never know. But what they did know was that Purdy's run would lead to CMC punching it in for the touchdown to tie the game. It would happen again early in the fourth quarter when Purdy would have a smaller run to save the drive, which eventually led to a field goal. The real dagger came late in the fourth quarter when, on 3rd and 4, Purdy would have his biggest run of the night to not only get the first down, but it would allow the Niners to get closer to the end zone to set up a big McCaffrey run and eventually the touchdown by Eli Mitchell. The score was now 24-34. This is what everyone had been waiting for. Could Purdy truly lead his team back from being down in the second half of a game? To answer the question posed from Nick Wright many weeks prior to this game, yes, Purdy proved that he wouldn't melt down if the Niners somehow found themselves behind in a playoff game. this time there wasn't anything anyone could say to take away from what Purdy had done in this game. Why? Because 48 rushing yards proved that Purdy could, quite literally, put the team on his back and carry them to victory. Yes, McCaffrey and Mitchell got the eventual touchdowns, but they wouldn't have been in that position to do so without those runs, even the second one, because it led to a field goal. This was the point where I said to myself, it doesn't matter what anyone in the media says. Purdy did it. He proved to everyone that said he couldn't do it wrong. The game would end with a final score of 31-34. The Niners, after coming so close last season, were going to the Super Bowl to face the Chiefs. And my favorite part of the whole thing, with the victory against the Packers and the Lions, the Niners had beaten every single NFC team that made it to the playoffs. And at the end of the day, 6 of those terrific quarterbacks would be sitting at home watching Brock Purdy play in his first Super Bowl in only his second season in the NFL. Stop me if you've heard this one before. I didn't know how to approach this episode. For many Niner fans, this is a game they want to forget, and for good reason. I mean, I've only ever watched this game once. In fact, the original title for this episode was Journey's End, because this series was only ever meant to be 2 seasons. But what's interesting about this game is that a lot of people like to use this game as justification for why Purdy isn't one of the top quarterbacks in the league, because he couldn't win the big one. He had his chance and he lost. He's just not that guy. One of the things I wanted to make sure when making this series was that I didn't lay the blame at anyone else's feet if the Niners lost the game and Purdy played bad. In the Browns game, Purdy didn't play well, but he led the team down the field at the end of the game and put them in position to win, but the field goal was missed. I didn't lay the blame at the kicker's feet because kicks are missed all the time. In the Vikings game, Purdy played well, but at one point he likely suffered a concussion, which led to 2 interceptions, and they lost. In the Bengals game, by stats alone, Purdy played great and was the team's leading rusher. But again, back-to-back interceptions, among a few other things, led to them losing the game. And in the Ravens game, Purdy didn't play well at all. 4 interceptions, regardless of circumstance, is hard to come back from, and they ended up losing. But in the Super Bowl, his first Super Bowl, he played well. The unfortunate part of this game, though, was that he had to overcome some misfortune, and as much as he tried to, the game just didn't go their way. An unfortunate fumble on the first drive, followed by some drive-stopping penalties on another, a blocked extra point, a muffed punt, and a freak injury all contributed to the loss. Notice how I didn't mention names? Because, as I said, that's not what this series is about. But if you ask a few people in the media, they'll be quick to mention the reason the Niners lost. Brock Purdy should have played better. Never mind the fact that Purdy walked off the field 3 times with the lead, twice in the fourth quarter and again in overtime. When that's brought up, people will be quick to mention that if Purdy was better, he would have walked off the field with a touchdown rather than a field goal, especially with Patrick Mahomes on the other side of the field. Yet they always seem to forget that in addition to all the things I mentioned earlier, the final nail in the proverbial coffin is the fact that one of the offensive line did not stick to his assigned block, which left Chris Jones free to rush Purdy. From the time Purdy receives the snap to the time Jones was in his face was about 1.25 seconds. To put that into perspective, the quickest average time for snap to release throws is 2.43 seconds. And people will say, well, Brandon Ayuk was wide open in the end zone. Yeah, he was. And if Purdy had any sort of protection on that play, it most likely would have resulted in a touchdown and possibly the win. But people don't really care about that, do they? Nothing is going to change the fact that the Niners lost the game. And so I thought, where does the story go from here? Purdy, in just 2 seasons in the NFL, went from Mr. Irrelevant to a starting quarterback in the Super Bowl. The story was over. There was nothing else left for him to prove to anyone. The theme of the season was media narratives. The media wanted to see many things from him. They wanted to see him play without all of his Avengers, and he did that in the playoff game when Deebo Samuel went down in the first quarter. They wanted to see him lead a game-winning drive, and if the field goal was made, he does it in week 6, but that didn't matter because he did it in the playoffs against the Packers. They wanted to see him be more than just a dink and dunk quarterback, And in my opinion, he did that his rookie year with all of the deep passes he made in various games, but that didn't matter because during this season he averaged 9.6 yards per attempt. That led the league, and he was 1.3 yards higher than the quarterback below him. They wanted to see him struggle, but then rise above it and lead his team to a comeback victory. And he did that in the NFC Championship when, after halftime, down 24-7, he and the rest of the offense scored 27 unanswered points. And he did that by putting the team on his shoulders 3 different times for a combined 48 yards, which led to 2 touchdowns and a field goal. He did all of that and never once changed the way he played. He didn't lose confidence when the team lost, and he didn't melt down when the team was down in the biggest moments. And in the Super Bowl, when the lights were brightest, he could hold his head high every single time he left the field with the lead. He truly showed everyone who ever doubted him that they were wrong. And in the end, for some, it simply didn't matter. I accepted the fact that the media was going to dismiss him because of the loss, regardless of how he played. It didn't matter that 30 other quarterbacks weren't playing in the biggest game of the season. It didn't matter that 6 other terrific quarterbacks were sitting on their couch like the rest of us watching the last pick in the draft playing a game that all but 2 of them had never even been to before. Nope, none of it mattered, because Brock Purdy was never supposed to step foot on a football field. That, more than anything, was why this was going to be the last episode of this series. Brock had nothing left to prove, and I didn't think there was any more that needed to be said. Unfortunately, one of the problems was that I started making this series in the middle of the 2024 season. The other problem was that this season started winding down after the 2024 season. And after the 2024 season, I quickly realized that what I had originally thought was completely wrong. The most ruthless, cutthroat critics in the NFL aren't media personalities. Oh no, far from it. The most ruthless, cutthroat critics in the NFL are the fans. After 2023, fans were singing the praises of the ultimate underdog. After 2024, however, fans were calling for him to be traded. And that is when I decided to make season 3. Because I felt it was time that people saw the season through the eyes of someone who could actually be objective. This series has never been about negativity, and that's not going to change. But I can't stand idly by anymore and watch as certain content creators try to divide the fan base and try to cause chaos with their bogus takes and revisionist history. And so, what used to be Journey's End is now just the beginning.